Making arguments is what the academic genres do. So this video is going to outline what an argument is and how to make one. You may be surprised to know that when I ask a student for a thesis statement, even a graduate student majoring in English, that I rarely get a thesis statement. This is because very few students actually know that a thesis statement is an argument. First and foremost, an argument begins by having an opinion about something. So, in order to make an argument or a thesis statement or a claim, you have to first understand your opinion concerning the topic on the table. But at its core, an argument is so much more than just an opinion. First of all, it's dressed up in a tuxedo rather than just jeans. You have to make an argument first a judgment. But a judgment of what? Before you can have a judgment about anything, it makes sense that there has to be a problem first for you to judge. So before you can even move into the terrain of creating an argument slash thesis slash claim, there has to be a problem or a number of problems related to your topic on the table. That makes sense, right? How do you engage and make a judgment about something if there isn't something first to judge? So the first step is to make sure you do something called problematizing. Making arguments really is a process. So let's start with the first step. You need to problematize some aspects of your context. If you haven't watched my video on context, go head back and take a look. But this is what some problematization might look like. Here is an excerpt from Paulo Freire's A Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Can you spot where he problematizes? I've underlined here a section of this paragraph where Freire problematizes because he denotes that students and teachers are becoming lifeless and petrified because of the narrative structure that they're engaged in. That's definitely a point of tension. He goes on to say that education is suffering from narration sickness, hitting you with a second related problem. I often tell students that if they have 5 to 10 problems associated with their topic, they're in really good shape to write a great academic essay. Here is an excerpt from a student essay about Japanese culture, used with permission. Can you spot where she problematizes? She begins by talking about how Japanese women are increasingly emerging in the working world. Then she goes on to note that the categorizations of masculinity for Japanese men remain stagnant. That's the first way that she problematizes. She goes on to further this problematization by noting that, especially for businessmen, the expectation of becoming their work is synonymous with becoming men. So she notes some things that are good about this, but also goes on to say that men are increasingly feeling less comfortable in the domestic sphere. She goes on to say that they feel extremely uncomfortable in their homes, and that the inside world is becoming increasingly inaccessible to them. She's saying that one of the major problems associated with this is that many men can only respond in silence as part of the culture. She goes on to say that this contrasts the female voice. She says that men have not been able to find a voice like the one women in the culture have been able to find. And finally, at the end, she notes that women have found a way to step beyond the constructs of institutionalization while men remain victimized by it. So you can see how she notes several points of tension in this line of inquiry. They're all related to each other. They build on each other as she is building toward her argument. And later she'll take a stance on judging some of these problems. Here's another example of problematization from the book, The Googleization of Everything. I went ahead and I underlined the areas that show problematization as the author builds up to the final problem, the overarching problem that will be addressed in the chapter. Problematization is really the act of identifying a point of tension, something problematic, something contradictory, something troublesome or alarming that you notice about any aspect of your context. Step 2 in what I would call the argumentation package is to judge, weigh in, bring in some ethical standpoints concerning each problem that you identify. That will help to move you toward making an argument or developing a thesis statement. So you want to judge the problem. It might look something like this. In her book, Something in the Soil, Patricia Limerick makes a lot of arguments. She builds arguments on top of each other. Her arguments here that I include that build on each other refer to the complications involved in trying to obtain a history of Indigenous people from textbooks that Americans are given. In the first excerpt here, you can see I underlined where she makes an argument. She says that the stories of the wars are narratives so tangled and dense that they defy clear telling. So here she's making a very clear point. She's taking a side and she's making a judgment. In the second excerpt, I also underlined a, a point where she makes an argument when she writes that they are also, of course, killing them off with a thoroughness that the United States Army did not, thank heavens, match. So here she's taking a position, she's making a judgment about the problem. You can tell exactly how she feels about it. And finally, in the third excerpt, I actually piecemealed this together from a couple different pages, but she writes that it is hard to find a way to tell the national story that does justice both to those who benefited from conquest and those who literally lost ground. And she goes on to conclude that there is today no longer any point in sorting out these passions and memories into starkly separate forms of ownership. So you can see each of these arguments, they are related to each other. They build on each other. Um, and they move her toward making her ultimate judgment here. If Limerick's arguments were a little bit difficult to follow, here's an excerpt from a student essay who was writing about Jane Eyre. This argument is incredibly simple but very effective. You can see at the end of the excerpt that I included that the student writes in a contrast between Ruskin's ideas and Bronte's ideas that Ruskin's really trump Bronte's. She writes that giving Ruskin's idea of men and women more credibility than Jane Eyre's. So she makes some observations here about the differences, and then she clearly takes a side in that polemic. Here's a final example, another simple example from some student writing that I used with permission of argument. This one appears as a traditional thesis statement, as in the very last sentence of the essay. Keep in mind, though, that thesis statements, arguments can really appear anywhere in the essay and should appear in numerous places. Um, in this essay, the student writes about the concept of masculinity in a couple of Victorian texts, and she ends her introduction by writing that as masculinity is jeopardized by zombie like figures in these two texts, male characters are forced to confront their fears and weaknesses, which helps them to serve as stronger icons for the nation. Once you have an argument or a judgment, why stop there? A great paper doesn't just have one argument or one thesis statement or one claim. Oftentimes, arguments and claims, they build on each other. So go ahead and make some more. Keep adding on. What does this claim lead you to? What does this claim lead you to? Claims that build on each other move a paper forward. So write down all the judgments that you can about each and every problem that you identify. The more arguments, the merrier. The third piece of the argumentation package is really stakes. Stakes is the articulation of why your position matters. So you have to break it down, right? Here are a couple examples of some stakes associated with the judgments slash arguments slash claims slash thesis statements.
Let's start out with some simple stakes. These stakes are taken from a student essay that I used with permission from the student concerning gender roles. And you'll notice that right here in the beginning of the excerpt are the stakes. It's interesting to note too that the argument from the student comes directly after the stakes. It's important to note that stakes and argument can have any kind of relationship. So the argument might come first, it might come 3 pages before or after. Really, it depends. Here, the stakes are when the student writes that placing gender roles within a society restricts human behavior. That's first and foremost telling the reader why it matters, right? Then she goes on to say that encouraging one form of behavior from another based on an ever fluctuating standard of distinct gender roles inevitably stifles and suppresses the masses. So it's actually a two-pronged stake there. Very well done. Here is another very simple articulation of stakes. This one comes from Judith Butler's essay on being beside oneself. She actually poses a question here, and then she follows it up immediately with her stakes. She asks, how do drag, butch, femme, transgender, transsexual persons enter into the political field? And then she comes at you with her stakes, which tells you why this is meaningful or important. She writes that they make us not only question what is real and what must be, but they also show us how the norms that govern contemporary notions of reality can be questioned and how new modes of reality can be instituted. I have really read so many amazing stakes in student writing that it's so difficult to choose the best ones. But here are 4 more examples from student writing used with permission from the student of stakes.
The final piece of the argumentation package is counterargument or counterclaim. It's very important that when you make a strong judgment that you're showing your reader that you always acknowledge counter perspectives or naysayers that are going to say the opposite or argue the opposite of what you say. It's a great rhetorical strategy to bring in counter argument to most of the claims that you present. This shows your writer that you're considering all perspectives, but that you believe your perspective is still the strongest and the best, and you're going to show them why. Here are a couple examples of how to integrate counter argument or counterclaim into your argumentation package.
There are certainly very sophisticated ways to bring counter argument and acknowledge counter perspective in your line of inquiry. However, I decided to keep it simple for these examples. These examples are taken from my student essays in my courses with their permission. I have here 4 excerpts from different essays about different texts, but I've underlined the areas that articulate or address some kind of counter perspective or naysayer. These are very basic but very effective strategies for integrating counter argument into your argumentation package.
So now you have a clearer idea about how to write a thesis statement, a series of claims, a set of judgments, of arguments, right? It looks different. It's not just a critical statement or an overview of what your paper is about or an overview of the points that you're going to make. You're standing strong in a set of ethical values. You're making clear, crystal clear, strong, aggressive, assertive judgments about something, about problems. You're taking a stance. You're taking a side. You're displaying your sense of right and wrong. And that is what an argument is all about. Let that drive your line of inquiry every step of the way. Let your paragraphs be driven by ethos, right? You're going to have a great paper.